In part 1 of this series of videos, I described 12 mistakes and breakages that occurred during the first half of my first season sailing Sea Change, my 1989 Pacific Seacraft, around the world alone. Here are the next 7 such events. Number 13. Anchoring in Makemo Atoll and the consequences. After failing to enter the South Pass at Makemo, my first atoll in the famed Tuamotus, that I was extremely keen to visit, because the outflow was very strong independent of tide, I went out to sea for the night and tried again the next day at the North Pass, which was similarly intimidating. After spending another night at sea, I returned the next day determined to enter, and waited till high tide around 4 p.m. to do so. It was still a formidable entry, requiring 3,000 RPM for a while, doing 1 knot, the hardest I ever ran the diesel engine. However, once in, I could not find the kind of anchoring spot that I had read all about, a large enough sandy spot that was not too deep. It was rapidly getting dark, and eventually I gave up searching and dropped the anchor in 80 feet, letting out all 200 feet of chain to have some scope. It was a relatively quiet night, but the breeze did move around a bit, and we wandered a little. The next day I was excited to try to get to the nearest motu and used the surf ski, but it was overgrown and somewhat disappointing. The following day I decided to leave, but the anchor chain was now solidly stuck straight down, presumably wrapped on rocks or coral far below. The advice in this situation was to determine which direction to motor to release the chain, but the water was so deep and so full of plankton that I could not free dive deep enough to see the chain and anchor. I had a scuba set up and had taken a refresher dive in Panama, as my PADI certification and last dive was from 1985, but I thought it unwise to attempt an 80-foot deep solo dive. That afternoon, a Norwegian boat named Adelante arrived with a young couple, Jens and Hannah, and offered to help. Jens came over on his dinghy, and we tried to bust free using the strong anchor bridle I had built in Panama, by backing up and then motoring hard forward, and repeating that several times managed to get the chain free till there was just 90 feet out, which we assumed meant the chain was now direct to the anchor. I bit the bullet and let out a few more feet, backed up and then forward hard. The bow almost went under, but with a big rumble sprang back up, and winching up the chain, to my huge relief, revealed the anchor still intact at the end. I followed them out the North Pass and sailed overnight to the wide open and easy North Pass of Fakarava. The consequence of this episode was only realized in a potentially dangerous situation. 2 years later, having anchored in many places and conditions, I was in one of the most remote anchorages in Tonga, the southernmost island of the Ha'apai group, called Calafessia, an uninhabited island, which my information indicated was a tricky small anchorage surrounded by reef that could accommodate 1 or maybe 2 boats. I got to Calafessia in mid-afternoon and happily found it empty, so gingerly worked my way past a shallow reef in the middle of the entrance and successfully anchored with reef all around us. Well, it's 4:30 on Thursday, August the 31st, and I've made it. Wow, what a trip that was, goodness me. To Calafessia Island, totally isolated. I'll go all the way around, even though the wind will get bad. Here's the reef on that side, and then in the glare of the sun, there's the reef on the other side, and there is reef everywhere else. This huge log here from the distance looked like a shipwrecked yacht, just to add to the nervousness of coming in here. Wow, what a place. I think I'm safely anchored. Those were famous last words, as the wind blew hard across the island that night, and the next morning when I raised the anchor, I was appalled to find that the anchor shackle had broken, but amazingly the pin was stuck in the final link of the chain, so I did not lose the anchor. If I had, despite having set an anchor alarm, we would most likely have ended up on the nearby flanking reefs. In retrospect, this shackle was too small, plus it was stainless, which decays in seawater, plus the strain of breaking out of Makemo Atoll 2 years previously surely had compromised its integrity. I should have replaced it long before, and as an interim measure rigged up this mess. Eventually I replaced the shackle with a rated galvanized one that was the biggest, whose pin fit through the last link of the chain. I also removed the swivel in front of it, as a friend lost his anchor when the swivel broke as it came over the bow roller. While this meant that without a swivel the chain would sometimes come up twisted and jump on the windlass gypsy, it was far better than potentially losing sea change. Number 14. The standing rigging. In Whakarava Atoll, I met up with my Australian friend Ian Watson again and invited him on board to look around sea change with his experienced eye, having built his large ketch, Jasmine, decades before and was completing his second circumnavigation. He suggested that given my standing rigging was original to sea change, hence 34 years old at the time, I should inspect it carefully. He said I should ping each of the outer 12 strands of the wires at the top of the bottom swages with a small screwdriver, because that is where salt accumulates and the wires are likely to corrode and break first. But it was more than a month later, alone in the remote Beveridge Reef between the Cook Islands and Niue, that I got around to it and discovered to my horror that each of the 7 wires I could access, the forestay was covered by the furler, had at least 1 and as many as 3 broken strands. I immediately set about getting backup rigging in place, using several spare halyards and sheets, noting that while I was up the mast, there were no broken strands at the top swages, consistent with the problem being salt corrosion at the tops of the bottom swages. Then I gingerly sailed the 125 miles to the remote island of Niue, which, like most of the Cook Islands and Tonga, was still closed to yachts for COVID, but I hoped would allow me to moor while I rigged more backup, which they did. Arriving at midnight, I took a mooring after evicting a sea snake, and the next day added my middle and lower lifelines and most of my mooring lines to the backup rigging, then sailed the 600 miles past Tonga to Fiji. At my check-in point of Savu Savu on the second largest island of Vanuatu in the north, I purchased short lengths of chain and sisted them across each of the 7 exposed swages, secured with wire clamps. Again, I could not access the forestay, but decided that the baby stay for the staysail, which was new in 2013 when Shane and Mary set off from Duluth, would keep the extremely robust mast from falling, as it was especially strong in the forward-aft dimension. I also replaced the mooring lines and lifelines with orange ratcheting truck tie-down straps for the inner shrouds, leaving sea change looking like a Christmas tree. Thus confident I would not lose the mast, even if the standing rigging broke, I proceeded for a month to sail around the eastern Lau group and then across the south of the main island of Viti Levu to Vunda Point Marina on the western side. There I once again met up with Ian, who suggested something he had done years before on Jasmine, which was to replace the bottom swages with long stud staylocks, one of 2 brands of mechanical fasteners that are generally considered to be superior to swages. The long stud versions are specifically designed to replace swages on existing wires, which seemed otherwise intact. With Christina's help, I ordered 8 from England at a cost of $800 and $200 shipping, and installed them with the help of a rigger showing me how to do it on the forestay, which, as expected, had no broken wires, being sheltered from sea spray by the furler. Upon my return the next season in August 2023, I brought 8 long Dyneema car tow ropes with me, and replaced all the backup rigging with them, concerned firstly about the wires themselves, and also about the remaining hardware from bolts to pins to toggles and turnbuckles. I used Dyneema strops at the masthead and top of the inner shrouds to make the backup rigging independent of existing hardware, but could not avoid using the chain plates, which are external and appeared in good shape, and when tapped with a hammer gave a reassuring ding instead of a worrying dong. Thus reinforced, I proceeded to sail back upwind to Tonga, which involved both a rough night and a tough upwind beat described in the last few videos, and spent a month sailing north through these wonderful islands. As described in the first of the roughest night videos, I made an unplanned departure from Tonga in the tail end of Oamarumu, and the next day discovered to my dismay that a strand had broken in the middle of a shroud, and closer inspection of all wires I could reach easily while sailing revealed additional possible broken strands. I decided that my backup rigging was nevertheless reliable and continued to sail across the north of Viti Levu and down the western Yasawa group of islands once again to Vunda Point Marina. It was now mid-October and I was hoping to sail to New Zealand, so finally decided I had to replace the wires. The local rigger only had half the length of the 6mm or quarter-inch wire I needed, and it took a week to get more. But fortunately, he did have a pack of the inner cones needed to reuse the long stud staylocks. Given that the upper swages had not suffered any issue, I had him put swages on one end and installed the staylocks on the other end of each wire, here gingerly threading the forestay through the furler, and re-rigged the boat myself, costing a total of $1,000. It is very impressive that the wires held up through all that sailing and being that old. As it turned out, there were multiple breaks all along the lengths of them. I nevertheless kept my backup Dyneema rigging in place. I had no issues with the standing rigging after that. Number 15. Corrosion problems at the start of Season 2. At the end of Season 1, in October 2022, I chose to leave sea change in the water in the cyclone-resistant oval basin at Vunda Point Marina on the southwest corner of Viti Levu in Fiji. I anticipated returning 6 months later, in April the next year, for Season 2. However, I was aware of a potential problem, which was that my left shoulder was exhibiting symptoms of rotator cuff damage, reminiscent of what I had endured with my right shoulder in 2020. That was eventually resolved by extensive rotator cuff surgery late that year, which required 7 months to recover. I now had the left shoulder surgery in April 2023, and having learned how best to recover, by August I was already in good enough shape to get back to sea change, 4 months late. Hence, she had been in the water for 10 months and suffered considerable corrosion issues in this hot, salty environment. First off, the large nut that tightens the stuffing box would not turn. In this diagram, it is the slightly leaking device on the propeller shaft that helps lubricate the shaft, which at this point looked much like these images from the web. But with the help of a lubricant called Corrosion X, I got it loose. A second issue was that the screws on the mounting bracket of the 5 horsepower outboard that attaches it to the transom of the dinghy, or here to the stern mount on the pushbit, were solidly frozen. Third, the throttle and transmission controls had fused together. These are a tricky setup of a hollow rod for the longer transmission lever that passes through this hole in the cockpit side, seen here from the inside, with a second rod passing through it for the much shorter throttle lever. No amount of Corrosion X or other penetrating oils, and as much force as I dared apply over 2 weeks of work preparing sea change for sea, could resolve these two problems. So I ended up taking them to a local marine shop run by the most arrogant and profane South African I ever met, and his workers managed to get them both apart, but not without breaking parts. The outboard bracket eventually worked okay, but the throttle control was damaged, so I replaced the lever on it with a pair of vice grips that got me around the world. Thereafter, whenever I left sea change for any length of time, I made sure these and other vulnerable places were well lubricated. And before selling sea change, I managed to reconnect the original throttle lever. Number 16. The manual whale pump breaks. In the first 2 seasons, I had repeated issues of flooding of the bilge. As mentioned above, Sea Change had a stuffing box arrangement to allow a slow dripping of water around the propeller shaft, which allows it to rotate in the cutlass bearing where it crosses the aft hull structure. Hence, inevitably, the bilge pump had to run occasionally to get this accumulated water out of the bilge. This stuffing box was pretty worn out and the stuffing compacted, so it became harder and harder to keep this water ingress to a drip, and sometimes it became a trickle. That was not a big issue, except that the wiring of the bilge pump and the associated float switch that detected high water levels, shown schematically here, was really badly done and several times corroded through, so that water built up in the bilge till I either noticed that the bilge pump was not running as often as usual, or I actually had water lapping into the cabin sole. When this happened, I had 2 options to clear the water before repairing the wiring, besides manually emptying with a small bucket. The first was a manual pump like this, led out to the cockpit, which is what I usually used. The second was a manual whale pump like this, installed in the port lazarette, with its extraction tube led from the very bottom of the bilge, even below the bilge pump. I was in Duff Reef on the extreme northeastern end of the Lau group on my way back from Tonga to Fiji in 2023, when I woke one morning to find the bilge overflowing onto the cabin sole, so badly that I decided to use the whale pump, which I had only previously tested gently to make sure it worked. Now I pumped it hard, and almost inevitably it broke at this connection point, the plastic having hardened and weakened. So I emptied the bilge with a portable manual pump, fixed the bilge pump wiring, and then fixed the whale pump, as shown here, with 2 small hose clamps. After refurbishing the stuffing box in New Zealand in 2024, I never had the need for the whale pump again. Number 17. The engine negative wire. The problem began in Fiji in that second season, with the engine having difficulty starting. Specifically, sometimes pressing the start button would only yield a click from the starter solenoid. Eventually, in a remote anchorage at Namina Island, I could not get the engine to start, despite disassembling the solenoid, which worked just fine when connected directly to a battery with separate wires. This is what the cockpit looked like while fighting with this problem. Having read of my woes on my blog, my kitesurfing friend Vince Salgado offered to help. With his knowledge of physics, he led me through a series of diagnostics involving measuring the voltage and resistance across various connections before and when attempting to start, and divined that the problem was the negative wire connection to the engine, which was different from this example, being via a large steel support plate that held the transmission and connected to the aft engine mounts. I accordingly disconnected it, ground clean all surfaces, and upon reconnecting, the engine started. Nevertheless, this problem reoccurred all the way to New Zealand, and while there I tried several additional solutions, including a dielectric grease on the connection. But eventually, the next season in Vanuatu, while avoiding a maramu for a few days on a mooring at the capital of Port Vila, I decided to tackle the problem again. Sitting in the open cockpit cover and repeatedly pressing the start button with the same result of a click and no starter engagement, I noticed that the negative wire to the engine was twitching each time, and upon touching it, discovered it was hot. This conductor had turned into a resistor. I removed the wire, which was twice the required length, probably too thin and clearly corroded in places, and with the help of Andy on Second Sun, replaced it with a shorter, thicker new wire, and that solved my engine starting problems for the rest of the circumnavigation. In retrospect, I should have solved this problem a lot earlier. Number 18. Torn jib on passage to New Zealand. In my video on tough upwind beats, I described my mistake in failing to furl the jib before the final squall, and it tore in half across an entire panel. This sail was my 100% jib, one of the three original Ullman sails, along with the mainsail and staysail, and hence 33 years old at this point. In Opua, I took it to the North Sails Loft, which charged $400 to replace the panel, and I left it with them till the next season, installing the Genoa in its place for my sailing within New Zealand. The replaced panel, third from bottom, is noticeable in this image. I had replaced the 130% Genoa with this jib near the Galapagos, as the Genoa felt overpowered in the strong trades, and this jib also performed much better when beating upwind. The only other time I used the Genoa was on the long light wind sail from Darwin to Ashmore Reef, described in my video on 10 longest calms. Number 19. Transmission oil leak in New Zealand. When I was sailing south from Opua to Whangarei in 2023, I noticed a whining sound coming from the transmission, audible in this clip as I persisted in motoring all the way up Whangarei Bay to Whangarei town itself for a reception for visiting cruisers. It's Monday the 27th of November and I am motoring up the river to the town of Whangarei. There I finally checked the oil in the transmission, a Kanzaki KBW10 unit like this, to discover it was almost empty. I filled it up and the sound diminished, but did not go away completely. Nevertheless, I was hoping to get out the entrance of the bay and sail on down to Auckland for a while. As I was passing Marsden Cove Marina, where I already had booked to leave Sea Change for the southern summer, forward gear finally quit completely. So I quickly tacked and sailed to the shallows outside the marina to anchor, called the marina, and they sent out a tender to tow us in, as there was no way I could sail in the long, narrow entrance channel. I called my friend Ed McLaughlin on Aka, who was in Opua, for help, and he said his master mechanic friend Brian in Opua, who specialized in repairing transmissions in his garage in retirement, would be able to repair it by swapping the worn forward plates, after some reconditioning, with the functional reverse plates, which looked like this. He also had another friend offering a used transmission with worn seals, so I bought the latter for $400, and Brian reconditioned it as well for a total cost of $600. This was obviously entirely my own fault, but made worse by the fact that I had noticed, while having issues with the bilge pump, that when I put my hand into the bilge water it was oily. But the oil was clear, not black like diesel engine oil, and I did not think it through that it would be transmission oil, which it turned out was leaking from a failed rear oil seal indicated here. Even if I had figured that out, I would have had to remove the transmission, which had a silver lining, because in doing so I had to remove this heavy steel plate that it bolted to, and then attached to the rear engine mounts. I had always worried about these mounts, as they seemed in bad shape. When I asked Brian about them, he tore them apart by hand. A nearby marine machine shop had a new set for $200, so I installed those when I reinstalled the repaired transmission. Sadly, that was not the end of my transmission woes, because halfway through my third season in 2024, when attempting to anchor off Horn Island opposite the famed Thursday Island at Torres Strait at the northeast corner of Australia, the anchor dragged repeatedly in the 30-foot deep channel of the anchorage. When it finally did bite, I ran the engine to 3,000 RPM in reverse to make sure it was well set, as there was a current flowing through the channel, which if we dragged further would take us into other down-current boats. And when you don't have any form of insurance, that is not something you want happening. I was not even thinking about the fact that these were the damaged but reconditioned previously forward plates, and at the time did not realize I had now burned them badly. From there, I sailed across the Gulf of Carpentaria and on to Darwin, where I anchored easily in Fanny Bay. Somewhat bizarrely, Australia required us to check out of Darwin, even if our destination was another Australian territory, in my case, Ashmore Reef, Christmas Island, and then Cocos Keeling. And to do that, we had to go to the fuel dock outside the lock that protects the Cullen Bay Marina from the massive tides of Darwin Bay. I approached this dock too fast, but assumed I could easily use reverse to stop us. Plus, my Australian friends David and Serena on Lady Contessa were there to take my lines, which was most fortunate because as I put the transmission into reverse and to 2000 RPM, nothing happened. And we only avoided smashing into the back of a fancy boat in front of us by the quick work of David and Serena catching my lines and throwing them around bollards to stop us. But even then, I did not fully understand what was happening and continued across the Indian Ocean until I got to Mauritius, where I finally came to understand that I no longer had effective reverse gear. I nearly banged into the back of Canadian Nick's Drake at the checkout port in Port St. Louis. And then, when I got to Richards Bay, was well aware that I no longer had reverse. So from there on, I had friends help me into and out of slips in the various marinas and harbors. I had checked with Ed about all of this, and he warned me that the burnt reverse plates would generate particles that, if not removed, would then in turn damage the forward plates. And indeed, when I replaced the transmission fluid, it was orangey brown instead of pink. Finally, as I left Port Elizabeth for the final long leg to Cape Town, I could not increase engine revs beyond idle before the forward gear started slipping. So I crept out of the harbour and into the bay at 1 to 2 knots, which also meant that when I finally got to Cape Town, 4 days later, with a howling southeaster blowing through the harbour and the Royal Cape Yacht Club, there was no way I could get in. So I asked the National Sea Rescue Institute, which was having practice exercises that day, for a tow-in. I replaced the original transmission with the used one I bought in New Zealand, which Brian had reconditioned, and that got me the rest of the way to Florida. In part 3 of this series of videos, I cover the last 11 mistakes and breakages in my 3rd and 4th seasons.